It is great to be back here. Jane and I were on retreat last week for our forgiveness retreat. We had an incredible time, and it's always great to be able to pull away, but it's always great to come back to. I'm so glad to be among you. Every year, the church brings up this strange story right at the end of Epiphany, right before Lent begins. It is a shimmering story. Jesus goes up on a mountain, and then his face just bursts into white. His clothes dazzle. Moses and Elijah appear. A cloud descends, a voice booms, and just when you think that it's starting, it's over. And their disciples are back on the road again. It's an odd story that we call the Transfiguration. Jesus tells them in verse 9 too, as they were coming down the mountain, Jesus ordered them, tell no one about the vision until after the Son of Man has been raised from the dead. The Transfiguration is just one of those stories that it feels like it belongs outside of time. It's not just something that happened once 2,000 years ago. It's something that feels like it keeps happening. It's similar to Jesus' baptism. It feels in the gospel archetypal. It reveals something true about who Jesus is, no doubt, but it also opens a doorway into deeper truth about who we are called to be and how God is at work beyond what we can easily see. Now, I know I've had moments where I have felt swept up, moments where I just knew this moment matters. It has lasting implications. We even talk about them as mountaintop moments. Actually, I can remember vividly, I was standing in the ICU with a church member. It was just over a year ago. And that was a mountaintop moment for him. He could have died, maybe should have died, but he didn't. He felt a peace about God's presence. He was assured, despite all the confusion and everything that was lighting up and beeping in the ICU, he was assured that that single moment had changed him. His posture towards life and the world was more open. He had a near-death experience, and it re-altered his faith and what matters to him now. And they know, I think as well as the disciples, that a transfigured faith is both deep and wide. Matthew is telling us a story that reminds us that God is always doing something deeper than our day-to-day awareness. And God's wisdom is always wider than what our narrow frame we have for faith. I think that's why we keep coming back to this story year after year. I think it's because it's easy to miss its depth. It is easy to shrink its breadth. Peter is the stand-in for all of us in this story. Peter sees something astonishing. Moses and Elijah have appeared on a mountain, and the voice of God is there. It is both terrifying and holy. And immediately, Peter tries to manage it. He says, Lord, if it is good for us to be here, if you wish, I will make 3 dwellings. And he meant one for Jesus, one for Moses, one for Elijah. Now, Peter isn't being malicious, he's being human here. He sees glory, and he thinks we need to preserve this. He encounters mystery, and he thinks we've got to contain this. He experiences transcendence, and he thinks we got to build something so it stays right here. Peter mistakes the moment because his faith, I would argue, isn't deep or wide enough yet. He doesn't realize that the Transfiguration isn't about stopping, it's about revealing. It's not about staying on the mountain. It's about being changed before going back down the mountain. And I think that's one of the hardest tensions that we as Christians have in faith. We love mountaintop moments, moments when God feels so close to us, moments when prayer just comes so naturally to us, moments when faith feels so obvious, it's so bright, and we want to build dwellings there. We want to freeze time there. We want to capture the certainty there, lock it in, the clarity there. But a faith that is only mountaintop faith, ironically, is a shallow faith. Because the point of the mountain is not for you to escape the world. It's so you can help go back to transform the world. A transfigured faith is deep enough to hold mystery, but it's wide enough to keep moving. Look what happens in verse 5. While he was still speaking, suddenly a bright cloud overshadowed them, and a voice from the cloud said, "This is my son, the beloved, with whom I am well pleased. Listen to him." Before Peter can finish his sentence, a cloud overshadows them. You know, in Scripture, clouds are never about clarity. They're about presence. The cloud says, you don't get to be in full control here. You don't get to define the moment here. You don't get to reduce God to something that's just manageable here. This is going to be extraordinary. It is out of the clouds that God speaks. This is my son, the beloved, with whom I am well pleased. And then the end, listen to him. You know, God doesn't say, build something for him. God doesn't say, figure him out now. God doesn't say, explain what's happening now. Instead, God says, just be. Just listen to him. What this tells me is that deep faith knows when to stop talking. A wide faith knows when to let God be bigger than our understanding. The disciples almost get there, but then, just like that, the moment's over. They look up. There's no Moses, no Elijah, no cloud, just Jesus, still walking towards Jerusalem, still moving towards the cross, still headed into suffering, complexity, and cost. I think a transfigured faith isn't one that has the obstacles ahead removed. I think it's one that says, the glory you glimpsed on the mountain is still present, even as you go forward and it may seem hidden. The belovedness that you saw there is still true, even when things around you get dark. The light that you witnessed on the mountain is deeper than the circumstances and wider than the fear that is ahead of you. I think this is why this story matters, because we live in a world that trains us to be narrow focused. I mean, narrow in our theology, narrow in our compassion, narrow about certainty, who's right, who's wrong. We live in a culture that prefers a shallow faith. Quick answers, easy slogans, faith that never has to wrestle, a faith that never has to wait, a faith that never has to wonder. But the Transfiguration refuses a faith that is narrow, and it pushes back on a faith that's shallow. It invites us into a faith that's deep enough to invite mystery and wide enough to allow ourselves the capacity to change. A faith that doesn't cling to moments, but allows those moments to reshape how we're going to go walk through the valley. At the end of the story, Jesus touches the disciples and he says, "Get up. Do not be afraid." That might be the most important line in all of this, because deep and wide faith doesn't eliminate fear. It teaches us how to move through it. It doesn't give us all the answers. It gives us enough light so we can take the next step. It doesn't keep us on the mountain. It sends us back into the world, transfigured just enough to love others more boldly. So maybe the question for us isn't, have you had a mountaintop experience, but rather, has your faith become deep enough to trust what you can't fully explain? Has your faith become wide enough to follow Jesus beyond your comfort zone? Are you willing to let God be bigger than the dwellings that you want to build? Because a transfigured faith isn't about staying where the light is obvious. It's about carrying the light, deep into our lives and wide into God's world. I remember a season when I felt especially grounded in my faith. Life wasn't perfect, but it felt aligned. Prayers came easily. Ministry felt purposeful. I was exercising regularly. I felt rhythms and not disruptions in life. There was a sense, it's hard to describe, that in that season, God was just near. And without even realizing it, I started to cling to that version of what faith ought to be. I wanted to preserve that season. I wanted to protect it. I wanted to keep it untouched. And then things slowly changed. You remember when COVID hit in March 2020? Remember the shock to the system? Man, that was tough. It rerouted everything for all of us. And similarly, I've had other seasons like that when questions surfaced, where certainties loosened, when life got more complicated than my theology had room for. At the time, it felt like a death, like a loss, like I was constantly doing something wrong and I was the cause of it. And it was like I had wandered off the mountain. But looking back, I'm starting to see those seasons very differently now. It was a loss. There are seasons in our lives that go up and down, no doubt about it. Something was gone and it wasn't coming back. But what I thought was faith slipping away was actually faith that was deepening. What felt like confusion was God widening the edges of my understanding. What I wanted to preserve, God was trying to transform. I did lose something in those seasons, but it wasn't faith. What I lost was the comfort of the shallow faith that I had. I had to move to the deep. Some of us make this move intentionally. Some of us, it's thrust upon us because of life. But here's what I know. When you move from a shallow and narrow faith to one that is both deep and wide, something sturdy grows. Something honest emerges. And that thing is a faith that can hold both joy and grief. Certainty and doubt. A faith that doesn't depend on everything shining all the time. That's what the Transfiguration offers us. Not a promise that the light will always be obvious, but a reminder that the light is real, even when we're back in the valley. A reminder that God's always doing something deeper than we can see and wider than we can understand. So when your faith feels like it's shifting, when the mountain fades and the road stretches through the valley yet again, don't assume that you're the one who's missed God. It might be God inviting you into a faith that is deeper than certainty, wider than you can imagine. It was true for the disciples. And I think it's still true for all of us, because it's a transfigured faith that is one that is both deep and wide.